episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another fascinating guest today who's helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us on many different fronts. Today we have the opportunity to be joined by Dr. Anne-Marie Kimball, who is a physician, epidemiologist, and currently holds the roles of strategic advisor to the Rockefeller Foundation, associate fellow at the International Affairs think tank Chatham House, and vice chair of the COVID-19 Task Force at the Rotary Foundation, Rotary International. In her work with Rockefeller, Dr. Kimball supports the strengthening and development of various strategies for Ebola, post-Ebola, and health crisis response, including planning and guiding the formation of a regional disease surveillance network in collaboration with the Connecting Organizations for Regional Disease Surveillance Network. Before joining Rockefeller, Dr. Kimball served as technical and strategic lead for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation surveillance strategy formation, and prior to Gates, she served as Professor of Epidemiology for the University of Washington School of Public Health with adjunct appointments in medicine and the Jackson School for Foreign Affairs. During her tenure at UW, Dr. Kimball founded and directed the APEC Emerging Infections Network and led the research and training program in surveillance and informatics in both Peru and Thailand. Dr. Kimball's research focus on global trade and emerging infections earned her a Fulbright New Century Scholars Award and a Guggenheim Scholars Award. She's also an accomplished author with her book Risky Trade, Infectious Disease in an Era of Global Trade, which was highly reviewed by the New England Journal of Medicine, Emerging Infections, and The Lancet. She has authored numerous scientific publications and served on a variety of institute medicine panels. She's also a fellow in the American College of Preventive Medicine and member of the National Biosurveillance Advisory Group from the Center for Disease Control. A lot to talk about here, but welcome Dr. Anne-Marie Kimball to the show.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great having you, Anne-Marie. I'd love to start off by handing you the floor for a few minutes to talk a little bit more about your background, because when I was going through sort of the early days, I realized you weren't always interested in infectious diseases. You did clinical rotations in areas like melanoma research, neurology. Talk a little bit about what got you interested in infectious diseases in the first place.
Well, that's a bit of a story. I've always wanted to be a doctor, and go into medicine ever since I was very, very young. But when I went into medicine, I was at first really taken with neurology. But infectious diseases has always been fascinating. And I guess, to be honest, after I learned quite a bit about neurology, I understood that many of those diseases we didn't have an answer for. And infectious diseases, on the other hand, we have prevention and we have treatment. So that's part of it. And I guess the other part is that infectious diseases are just it's amazing to me to watch another life form interact with our life form and change and mutate and design strategies, etc. So it just was all consuming once I made the switch.
And as part of that, you joined the U.S. CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Services, which is this unique 2-year sort of postdoc work. It focused on epidemiology, and they focus on getting you in the field, creating so-called disease detectives. Doing a little look into it. I mean, the EIS, it's formed back in the early 1950s. It sort of had an initial sort of Cold War, Korean War, sort of looking out for biologic weapons and so forth back in the day, but evolved into sort of, as I said, more disease detection, traveling the world for looking at outbreaks of anthrax and hantavirus and West Nile. Talk about, your sort of why you went into the EIS, sort of the initial days there, and a little bit of some of those journeys, which has taken you to some unique territories around the world, let's say.
Surely. I actually joined the CDC in the family planning branch to work on abortion surveillance for mortality with Ward Cates, who was our branch chief. And I really found the intersection between epi and medicine fascinating. And from there, I moved to Washington, D.C. as the health officer, basically, for the district. And there was where I really understood the power of disease investigation in looking at the root cause of why people got sick with infections. Specifically, we had a large outbreak in Southeast Washington, and we tracked it to the construction of, national capital housing units and the shortcuts that had been put in place in the plumbing. So it's those simple things that can really result down the road in people getting very ill and loss of life. It's just a fascinating field, and it's been a fascinating time. I also then went on my first infectious disease outbreak, cholera, in the small country of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. And we were able to make a definite link between the introduction of bottle feeding in the newly affluent societies there with the risk of cholera, because they had not yet improved the source of water and sanitation. So they were doing bottle preparation in very unhygienic situation. So it's those kinds of links that allow us to move from curative medicine to prevention to policy, and eventually make things safer for everyone.
And while you were, in places like West Africa, I know you were in the Ivory Coast, you were in Senegal. I guess Ebola obviously was, one of the areas that you've been involved in, but you were chasing down. Any interesting? Obviously, we hear about Ebola, we hear about, occasionally about hantavirus, things of that nature. While you were out there sort of in the field, and obviously if there's anything confidential, you don't have to go into that, but did you run into any, because we've got people on the show like Suzanne Murray down at the Smithsonian and Jonna Mazet from UC Davis that are sort of doing this with the large scale sort of virome exploration. We got millions of other weird things out there that may be coming our way, hopefully not, but did you run into any odd things along the way that maybe don't have a name or were scary to you at the time? And, well, that didn't happen. But aside from obviously the other scary things that we know about that you were chasing at the time.
Well, I'll be honest, it's been an extremely steep learning curve, and I think it would be for anyone going into global health. I did my first tour in West Africa, my first work in 1981. So what I learned from that were a number of things. First of all, that the establishment, if you will, in the funders doesn't always listen carefully enough to the people who are actually being impacted and affected. And in terms of strange and wonderful things, what was very odd to me was we had a vaccine for meningitis, and yet we were still seeing waves of enormous mortality from meningitis in Burkina Faso. And I didn't understand, if you have, this was a learning curve. If you have a vaccine, why isn't it being deployed in the areas that are most impacted? And what you find when you begin to dig into that is a lot of it is cost. A lot of it is the ability to administer. So we did a small project with the Centers for Disease Control with Dr. Claire Broom coming in to Burkina and introducing the vaccine just to show, yes, it really does work in this scenario. It can work in this scenario. And yet it took 30 years to see the MenA rollout in across the meningitis belt. So what you learn in global health is that there are many, many things to consider. It's really multidisciplinary. Medicine is a piece of it. You have to show it works, but then you have to prove that you can build the collaborations and trust and infrastructure, but infrastructure being also giving people opportunity in the areas you're working in to have their own leadership in their own direction. So it's been a real journey, but that was the first sort of, well, at 31, I was like, I don't get it. Why isn't it already here? And so some of the lessons you learn are not so pleasant, and you understand the struggle is going to be a lot longer than you thought.
hmm and along those lines, I didn't get to, at the intro to go into this part of your bio, but you've been actively involved in HIV and AIDS. You were a director of national program support for the Pan American Health Organization. You served as director of the HIV/AIDS for Washington State and founding chair of the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors in the U.S. Obviously, well, I guess it can be sort of seen as a hot zone type thing as well, but obviously AIDS a much broader issue. Obviously, you were at the epicenter of it during the point when it became a global pandemic. Talk about some learnings also, please, from that part of your career as well into the current day.
Happy to, happy to. Actually, in West Africa, we had HIV too, so we did not see clinical AIDS.
Okay.
And then when I moved to Washington and took up the post as national program support for PAHO, we had a major epidemic going on, both in the United States and all throughout Latin America. So couple lessons I learned there. First of all, the North American media portrayal of HIV/AIDS as a disease of what we called homosexuals at the time, and now we would talk about as the gay community, was highly stigmatized. And our own president at the time, you may remember, never said the word AIDS, and frustrated our national efforts. And then working in Latin America and in Caribbean, what that meant was that in those societies where the primary transmission was to people who were receiving blood transfusions, hemophiliacs in the first sense, and secondarily a lot of heterosexual transmission and transmission among bisexual communities, which were hidden gay communities, that actually that was such a disservice, because then what happened was you were unable to broaden your prevention adequately in many of the societies because it was so stigmatized. Now, here's an irony. What happened with the AIDS leadership in Latin America was that most of the men did not want to be identified as directors for the AIDS programs in their ministries of health, because it was considered too threatening to their own reputations. And therefore, most of my directors in Latin America, throughout Central America, all through, well, not Mexico and Brazil, but down into Chile and other areas, were women. Women stepped up and became the directors of the AIDS programs. And that was really a first. So it's ironic that sometimes that very stigmatization and bad thing that's happening in public health is also an opportunity for a group that doesn't believe that or has a different vision. Yeah, it was fascinating. Working in Latin America was a true gift, and I was really, really honored to work with the country's amazing leadership from the countries themselves. Most of our teams we put together did not rely on US expertise, because there's plenty of expertise in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico. It's an amazing region. I guess the other thing I would say is I get surprised with our very narrow view from the United States of this wonderful world to our south. So it was quite an experience. But we cleaned up the blood supply as a priority. And that was difficult to do in Central America. We had one country where they had proprietary blood banks, and so that was more difficult. But I think the things that we did really saved a lot of lives in Latin America.
Now, Emery, moving on, you write the book "Risky Trade: Infectious Diseases in Era of Global Trade," and if I hadn't looked, I would have thought you just wrote this book, a couple of months ago. But you published in 2006, and basically, I mean, it's almost like a crystal ball of a book, you touch on sort of the silo mentality between scientific disciplines. You talk about zoonosis. You talk about the impact of global trade on infectious disease and pandemics. You go into sort of the need for stronger public health, the use of surveillance, the use of quarantine, the national biodefense and the national pharmaceutical stockpile. And you warn in the book about, stop all the happy talk. This stuff is, no joke. It's, not enough to just, stop this little outbreak here. There's an integrated system of international organizations, governments, non-governmental organizations. This is a much bigger issue, whether it's SARS or MERS or COVID or whatever we have. 2006 required reading for anyone in 2022. Talk about, why'd you write the book? What was going on at the time? Why'd you write this book? And how can we get this to be required reading for everyone involved in this chain of events that is required to control pandemics in the future?
Well, I wrote the book primarily because I was working very heavily with the trade organizations. It's obvious that if we're going to have international pandemics, that microbes don't swim. You could put it that simply, right? Mm-hmm. They get on airplanes, they get in trade, and we pass them around through those vehicles. And that was until 2020. Just a burgeoning area with more and more volume and more dollar value and closer connections through what we call globalization. And honestly, not adequate thought about what the risks are. And then when the risks appear, a tendency to minimize or diminish in the interests of still making the bottom line. So I think it's absolutely critical, if you value human life and wellness, mm-hmm. that we look at those systems. We need to understand that we're probably historically the most mobile human society on the planet. Yep. It's amazing. Our epidemiology that we use is largely place-based, but I won't go into all of that. What actually spurred me to write the book, frankly, was it's very frustrating to be working in depth in an area and not have access to the ongoing conversation that's going on, especially with trade. So I started looking very seriously at trade. My own state is extremely trade dependent, Washington State, sure. And mostly Far Eastern trade. And trade has been seen as how countries like South Korea, for example, built themselves back after World War II. Mm-hmm. And that's how countries move themselves and their populations out of poverty. So it's a very important developmental tool, but it's not without its own inherent risks. And so that was really the impetus to begin to say, this is risky, there are risks, and we're going to have a major pandemic. SARS-1, the first SARS outbreak, mm-hmm. was sort of a shot across the bow. Yep. But we had already seen with HIV/AIDS that when we had no ability to detect the agent in 1985, we had already been for 5 or 6 years exporting concentrations of factor VIII. And those require, consolidation of thousands of blood donors. Mm. And so basically we had a contaminated blood pool for some time before we realized it. And that exportation and interchange and commerce was really how HIV was introduced into a number of countries and geographies. The best report being the one from Canada that I cited in the book. And yet it took a long time to have the industry address that, because people are, well, as you can understand, it's not good for business if your product is seen as contaminated or dangerous. And so it really was a clash of interests, but we have to be very straightforward and honest. And that's what is terribly difficult for politicians. Mm. And you can appreciate that. Yep. So yeah, the book was definitely a journey, looking at all the literature from the veterinary side, You have to bring in a lot of studies from economics, but also looking at the business world. Business is really what, drives the capitalist system and what I call the enterprise system all throughout the world. And if you don't understand the motivations and concerns of that system and those people deeply involved in it for their very livelihood, you can preach to them all that you want, but you have to really understand their perspective and try and reach across and say, okay, well, we're all human. We all value human life. Nobody wants to get sick. And that really was the push for the book.
Excellent. Well, I definitely believe this should be required reading for anyone in the space looking forward. And I'm glad that I encountered it via meeting you. Going back to the story that you told at the beginning about the meningitis vaccine issue, and then you were just talking about business. You just spurred something in my mind here. I just wanted to ask you about it and get your feedback. Obviously we're in a unique era now, a new set of technologies. The mRNA technology has gotten this SARS-CoV-2 vaccine to us extremely quickly. It's revolutionizing potentially the way we create vaccines. However, on another show I just did a couple of months ago, we were talking about tuberculosis, which is the #1 infectious disease killer around the world. And we were discussing the fact that the last vaccine that we created for that was in 1921. And that the next tuberculosis vaccine isn't predicted to hit the market till 2030. Thinking about your meningitis story a bit, please just take the floor on this one, your thoughts, ideas on, sort of how we tip the scale towards this cooler new technology for all types of infectious diseases that we're encountering around the world, whether they're the common ones or the stranger tropical diseases and everything in between.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And, there's been programs that they have labeled neglected infectious diseases, which are diseases that are hyperendemic or endemic in poor populations. If you translate poor populations to no market, I think you probably have some of your understanding of
Sure.
why these are not being paid attention to. So going back to the point of how mobile we are, what you're hearing here when we look at the distribution of the mRNA vaccines and AstraZeneca around the world, for example, what you saw was how a market doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
And you have to take yourself back to some of the work of Stiglitz and some of the other economists, because it's a myth that risk over there will stay over there.
Right.
It simply won't. It will come and visit you. And so vaccinating, only the wealthy countries and then leaving the poor countries with hyperendemicity of COVID is going to bring us new variants and more illness at home. So if you move out of the humanitarian space, which is where most of us work in medicine, that is to say, core value is human life and wellness. Absolutely. Okay. Having said that, if you move into the second piece of that, the sort of corollary, it's like, and in your own self-interest, if you can't gin up the empathy to look at those lives lost and empathize, then, if you're worried about your own self, take a look at this, because this is also really, really true with the mobility that we have today. It's very, very much, I think, an object lesson when you think that yes, they created these vaccines in record time. The Operation Warp Speed, on the other hand, was incredibly remunerative for pharma. And those agreements are not open to public scrutiny, because we were in a panic mode. We were in a desperate mode. And the government, made these agreements, fine. But then sharing the vaccines around the world has proven that unless countries are able to pay. And even sometimes when they are able to pay, if they don't have the prospect of future markets, they don't get prioritized. So you had Canada a few months ago with 3 times its population reserved in vaccine doses, and the United States somewhere similar. And yet in Africa, we have less than 5% of people vaccinated. The other part of this that's also not been talked about an awful lot is if you look at the data from Africa, which of course we're doing a lot with the task force, you don't see a lot of disease, you don't see a lot of diagnosis, because you don't see a lot of diagnostics. Because the other thing that didn't get there were the tests, you know. So if you can't test, you can't report. And that's always a conundrum in surveillance. So it's been a real object lesson. I believe we're coming around the corner over these next 2 quarters to get much more vaccine into Africa. I think, you know, these new wonderful technologies should be shared, and I think there should be turnkey operations in a humanitarian sense to say, okay, we figured out how to do this here, you go do it too, we'll train you, we'll share our technology. And you're seeing real reticence on that. So these are real issues, and they're not strictly biomedical. They're mostly social and commercial.
I was actually just reading though before you got on the call about I think it was both Rwanda and Senegal. There was some MOU that was just signed with one of the mRNA companies to set up some factories in Africa. So hopefully we'll see a lot of that ramping up, hopefully in the coming months. You know, you are, aside from all the things that you are involved in, you know, you're also the vice chair of this COVID-19 task force for the Rotary Foundation, Rotary International, which is, you know, a rather broad international service organization, 35,000 clubs worldwide, 1.2 million individuals. What are you up to with the Rotary organization? Because it seems like a great platform to get your ideas out there. To I don't know if you're focusing on vaccine hesitancy or other international issue. Talk a little bit about what's going on at the Rotary and what the task force is all about.
Oh, sure. I actually have been a Rotarian for about 25 years.
Cool.
I joined when I was at the University of Washington, and that was because I wanted to get to know the downtown community. I wanted to get to know the business community in line with what I believe we have to do, which is sort of bring those interests together with the humanitarian and academic interests, and really, you know, begin to collaborate actively. So when the pandemic hit, you know, Rotary is, in my view, a perfect organization to address exactly the kinds of things you and I have been talking about. If you look at polio, what we hope, we're about 10 months out of the last wild virus polio case. So we may actually be looking at a success in the eradication of polio. But if you look at how long have we had to work all over the world to develop cold chain, to develop workforce, to work with Rotarians. We have clubs, we have 3,500 clubs in India. We have, you know, hundreds of clubs in Pakistan. We have 2,500 clubs in Brazil. I mean, so Rotarians are everywhere. And part of the reason that polio worked was because these are Rotarians' dollars that are going in, being donated year after year after year. And it's in the interest of Rotarians everywhere to keep an eye on how they're being spent. So you have this nice kind of transparency function with the civic society, with Rotarians watching and saying, okay, well, here comes our program dollars. Are they going the right place? That's part of it. But the other thing I think it's proven is that it takes an awful lot of investment and an awful lot of effort and some true leadership to actually succeed. So given that understanding, you begin to understand that to prevent and protect populations against infectious diseases, we need to pay attention to the basics,
Mm.
water and sanitation. We need to pay attention to nutrition. And we need to help poor countries have the public purse to create systems to protect their populations generally. We're the wealthiest country in the world. It's partly our burden, but it's also something we share across the world through Rotary. The other thing about Rotary that I think is outstanding is what we call the four-way test.
Okay.
And that is it true? Is it beneficial to all concerned? Is it kind? Is it truth? And we use that four-way test. It's almost like the Pledge of Allegiance for Rotary. And you can understand as we look at questions of conspiracy theories and vaccine hesitancy and confidence, that's exactly what we need to do, is drill down and try and get as close to the scientific truth and share it through the organization. So I'm truly honored to have been invited by John Hugo and the task force to join them. It's been almost a year I've been working with them now. And Ravi Kavindran from Sri Lanka chairs it. Ravi being a polio hero who's just done amazing things with polio. We have been really working through our polio networks we have a new MOU with COVAX to try and work in selected countries where we can really make a difference. And then we've given out more than $40 million of global grants from Rotary to our clubs to work on the ground, to help with things like PPE and information campaigns and food assistance in food insecure areas. So I think it can make a big difference. And it's been really, to me, inspiring because all Rotarians are basically volunteers. And this is also where you can bring business in. When I've been asked by a number of businesses, how should we get involved? And I always advise them to go through a Rotary type service organization or to go through their professional organization or industry organizations. And what you get there is, instead of getting one interest or entity in business coming in, like the dog guarding the dog food and saying, oh, I'll go in and help the public sector, and by the way, I want all the contracts coming my way, everybody's watching. And that's the only way that you're going to really get true collaboration and not self-interest. It's just the nature of the beast. So it's been fascinating, really fascinating.
Outstanding. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating part of your story, definitely. What's next for Dr. Anne Marie Kimball in 2022? I mean, you're involved with Rockefeller, Chatham House, doing the Rotary work. Any other things that I missed, stuff that's coming up, conferences you're going to be speaking at that we should be tuning into? Please take the floor if there's other areas that I've missed.
Well, I should correct the record, because the Rockefeller work I did some years ago, and I'm not really closely involved with Rockefeller anymore at this point. I've become very fascinated with the world of volunteerism and community action, particularly through Rotary. So I see that involvement moving forward. I actually spent a scholarship month at Bellagio almost 3 years ago now, drafting up a book as a follow-on to Risky Trade. I still have aspirations to write that book.
Please do.
It would be quite a different book based on this pandemic. But I think the themes really do need to be looked at again. I think the world has changed so profoundly with this pandemic in both good ways and bad ways, that I think taking another look at how do we prevent pandemics over time would be a real service to the generations coming after us.
Absolutely, most definitely. Well, it's you've been on a fascinating journey, Marie, and I just really wish you the best with all of this and what you're going to be doing next, moving forward. I mean, it's as we say on our show, it's all about a better tomorrow, and you're clearly on the path to helping create it for all of us via your initiatives. For everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode across our podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel. You've been listening to Dr. Anne Marie Kimball, physician, epidemiologist, Associate Fellow at the International Affairs think tank Chatham House, Vice Chair of the COVID-19 Task Force at the Rotary Foundation. Please pick up her book, Risky Trade, Infectious Diseases in the Era of Global Trade. Anne-Marie, once again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us. Thanks for everything you've been doing. And once again, as we say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow through everything you've done across your career. Really, really fascinating story.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Ira. You're doing great work. Thank you.
Thanks so much.